A few years ago, I was having coffee with a friend, a thoughtful, kind person who also happens to be a devout Christian. We got talking about faith, and, eventually the conversation turned to the idea of hell. And I'll never forget the shift in her demeanor. Her usual warmth just seemed to retreat behind this polite, practiced wall. She said, gently but firmly, that the popular image of a fiery pit of eternal torment was a medieval distortion, a corruption of the original loving message. That hell, in its most terrifying form, just wasn't really what Jesus taught. It was more of a theological misunderstanding that had, gotten out of hand over the centuries. And to her, this wasn't just an opinion. It was a comforting necessity. It was a way to reconcile a compassionate God with the doctrine that felt, and she actually said this, morally impossible. What struck me was her absolute conviction that this severe version of hell was an aberration, a later add-on that the core faith could and should shed. But then later that week, I was reading an entirely different kind of text, not a modern apology, but the ancient Gospels themselves. And the Jesus I encountered there spoke with a chilling, relentless clarity about eternal fire, outer darkness, and weeping and gnashing of teeth. The contrast was jarring. It made me wonder which narrative was bending to fit which reality. Was the gentle modern reinterpretation the truth? Or was it perhaps a desperate attempt to clean up what was always there, right in the foundational text? That contradiction between the comforting modern story and the stark ancient words on the page is where this whole question begins.
And that contradiction, that gulf between the kind, modern understanding of faith and the, frankly, brutal ancient text, that's exactly what we're diving into today. Our mission for you is to trace the historical and theological evolution of the afterlife concept itself. We want to start from the earliest ancient world and map its dramatic and its very nonlinear journey through millennia of cultural pressure. We want to understand precisely how the destination for all souls shifted from a morally neutral resting place to a meticulously designed pit of eternal torment. And this journey was driven less by a seamless theological progression and more by severe socio-political necessity, strategic ideological engineering, and a powerful philosophical backlash that really continues to define modern spirituality. This is a deep dive into how a concept was born, amplified, and ultimately challenged by the very moral and rational framework it helped establish.
Okay, let's unpack this because the starting point is so crucial. And I think it's often the most surprising part for people who are steeped in modern Western religious thought.
We're investigating the origin story of hell, and we have to start by acknowledging that if you go back to the original foundational texts, the Hebrew Bible, the concept of hell, as my friend understood it, this fiery destination for sinners, it just doesn't exist.
It is entirely absent. This singular construct for the afterlife available in the Hebrew Bible, the ancient scriptures of Israel, is Sheol. This is the only destination, and the most crucial thing to understand about Sheol is that it was morally flat.
Morally flat.
Meaning it was not a place of punishment or reward. And what's remarkable is how consistent the material is in stating that the souls of both the righteous, figures like Abraham and David and the wicked resided there together. It was universal. That is so counterintuitive to us. We just assume that a just God must immediately sort the good from the bad after death. But Sheol suggests that death, not morality, is the final determining factor. So it's not about judgment. It's just the physical consequence of being mortal.
Exactly.
So what was Sheol actually like textually? It wasn't just a place. It was a state of being. And from the sounds of it, a horrifyingly bleak one.
Oh, the textual descriptions paint it as an immense, desolate underground realm. You should think of it as a subterranean megalopolis defined by darkness, dust, and gloom. It's often described with its own gates, bars, and stern guards. The prevailing imagery is that it's inescapable once you enter. It's the absolute antithesis of life, light, and vitality.
And this wasn't unique to the Israelites, right? This idea of a gloomy underworld for everyone was pretty common in the region.
Very common. If you look at the parallels across the ancient Near East, you see this morally neutral concept echoed. The Babylonian underworld, Aralu, was often called the House of Dust, and it reflected this common, non-punitive destiny for all the dead. The early Greek concept of Hades was also initially a common realm, not some fiery pit.
So Sheol is less about eternal torment and more about eternal dimness. But let's get specific about the state of those who reside there. We aren't talking about conscious spirits reflecting on their lives or awaiting judgment. We're talking about a kind of minimal, almost erased existence.
Minimal is generous. Those in Sheol were referred to as shades or rifane. And although they had some vestige of existence, they were considered necros, the dead. They had no strength, little awareness, and crucially, minimal consciousness or memory.
So the horror wasn't pain, it was oblivion.
It was oblivion. The core theological horror of Sheol was being cut off. Psalm 88 captures this profound separation and lack of consciousness so well. The writer asks God, "Do you work wonders for the dead? Do the shades rise up to praise you? Is your steadfast love declared in the grave?"
Yeah.
And the rhetorical implication is a definite, terrifying no.
That sounds just terrifyingly nihilistic for a culture so committed to a covenant with a living, active God. If God saves you and acts in history, how do you possibly reconcile that promise with an afterlife that's just a quiet, hopeless void?
It was a massive tension. Early Israelite thought really assumed that death marked the end of worthwhile existence altogether, full stop. The physical destruction of the flesh led to the return to dust, as Genesis 3.19 states. The body dies, the blood dissipates, and what remains is a kind of phantom existence. Their entire focus was on this life, on longevity, progeny, and immediate earthly blessings. There was no concept of a spiritual reward that compensated for suffering in life.
And the sheer dread of this non-existence is captured perfectly in that line from Ecclesiastes, the text that seems to wrestle most brutally with this hopelessness.
Yes. The horror of Sheol is summarized brutally by Kohelet in Ecclesiastes 9.4. A living dog is better than a dead lion. Just think about the weight of that statement. Even the most wretched living creature is fundamentally better off than a dead king, a mighty hero, or a prophet.
Why?
Because the living have connection to God and to the light. The dead are cut off. It was a common destiny. And in the early texts, any evidence for a belief in eternal life or a differentiated judgment after death is, at best, marginal.
So to summarize our foundational understanding,
Yeah.
if you're living in ancient Israel, the afterlife is a dark, dusty, morally neutral basement where everyone goes. And that is the worst possible fate because it means you cease to have meaning, memory, or communion with God. That is a world away from the fiery pit we picture today.
It's a concept of absolute mortality. And it's important to remember those external parallels. The Mesopotamian Erilu and the early Greek Hades both reinforce this universal misery, devoid of judgment. Now, you contrast that with the Egyptian tradition. They had the Book of the Dead, complex judgment rituals, the weighing of the heart against the feather of Ma'at. The Israelites explicitly rejected the Egyptian model of moral judgment after death. They stuck instead to the morally flat Sheol.
That historical context is so necessary for us to appreciate the seismic shift that happens next. How do we get from a dusty basement for all souls to a strictly divided realm where the righteous are enjoying peace and the wicked are in chains and fire? A shift this dramatic must have required an enormous cultural and theological upheaval to justify it.
It absolutely did. This transformation was not a seamless theological upgrade. It was an acceleration driven by immense real-world pressure. The shift really takes hold during the Second Temple period, specifically around the 2nd century BCE. This was the era of the Maccabean crisis.
Remind us of the stakes there. What exactly was happening during the Maccabean crisis that demanded such a radical reimagining of the afterlife?
This was a period of severe oppression under the Seleucid Greek ruler Antiochus IV Epiphanes. Antiochus attempted to forcibly Hellenize the Jewish population. He forbade Jewish practices like circumcision and Sabbath observance, and even dedicated the temple in Jerusalem to Zeus. The righteous were literally suffering and dying, often brutally, for their fidelity to the covenant. And this created an acute, intolerable problem of theodicy.
Theodicy, the question of how a just and all-powerful God can allow evil and suffering to exist, especially when the righteous are martyrs and the wicked oppressors are prospering.
Exactly. If the righteous die believing in God, and their reward is merely the dust of Sheol, while Antiochus IV dies a prosperous, if terrible, death, and also goes to the same dusty Sheol, where is God's justice? The traditional afterlife model just broke down completely in the face of widespread, unjust martyrdom. They had to find a way to make God just, and they found it in eschatology.
So to solve the problem of unbearable injustice on earth, they had to invent a guaranteed final justice in the afterlife.
That urgency triggered the monumental shift where Sheol transformed from uniform misery into a place of differentiation. Suddenly, the experience after death was no longer the same for everyone. Apocalyptic texts from this era, notably 1 Enoch and the Wisdom of Solomon, began asserting this division forcefully. 1 Enoch describes 4 distinct chambers within Sheol, chambers for the righteous and chambers for the wicked, each awaiting a final, different fate.
So the righteous soul departed to a place of blessing and chambers, a kind of pre-heaven, while the wicked soul went directly to a place of torment.
Yes, the righteous were now enjoying peace, often guarded by angels. In some traditions, the most virtuous even skip Sheol entirely, ascending immediately to a heavenly paradise.
but the wicked soul was immediately consigned to a place of prejudgment torment.
But division wasn't the only solution proposed in this era. Some texts offered a powerful physical alternative that bypassed the whole soul debate entirely.
That was the resurrection alternative, championed in texts like Daniel 12 and 2 Maccabees 7. Here, the idea wasn't so much about the state of the soul in the underworld, but the fate of the person. The righteous would be granted a new, eternal body in an earthly kingdom at the end of days. This view reserved the ultimate fate of the wicked as simply being left out of this grand, eternal physical existence.
So total extinction or annihilation for them.
Right.
So in the 2nd century BCE, we have two competing, differentiated ideas emerging simultaneously. A soul afterlife with separated compartments, this divided Sheol, and a bodily resurrection for the faithful, which implies annihilation for the faithless. Now we finally approach the iconic image. Where does the fire, the definitive element of hell, finally enter the script?
That's where Gehenna comes in, and it's a brilliant piece of ideological repurposing. Gehenna is the Greek transliteration of the Hebrew Hinnom, the Valley of Hinnom. This was a ravine just outside Jerusalem, historically notorious. It was associated with ancient idolatry, specifically child sacrifice to the god Molech centuries earlier.
So it already had this deep association with profound wickedness and spiritual corruption.
Exactly. It was a place of deep negative connotation. And by the time of the Second Temple, it was famously used as the city's continuous refuse dump, a place where trash, dead animals, and the bodies of executed criminals were thrown. Legendarily, fires burned perpetually there to consume the waste. It became the designated otherworldly place of punishment, distinct from Hades or Sheol, which remained the general holding pen for all souls until the final judgment.
And this concept was explicitly ideological, serving as encouragement for the in-group.
Absolutely. The division of the afterlife and the concept of Gehenna were explicitly driven by polemical or apologetic impetus. The terrifying visions of punishment functioned as profound encouragement for the persecuted Jewish community, the in-group, by promising the eventual downfall and torment of their oppressors, the out-group. It provided final, guaranteed cosmic justice for those who watched their family members martyred.
Here is where the tension established in our opening narrative becomes particularly jarring for the modern reader. We arrive at the New Testament, and this language of eternal torment is placed directly on the lips of Jesus, the figure most associated with grace and love.
The Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are the first texts in biblical literature where the construct of what is unequivocally understood as hell, Gehenna, appears as a place of eternal suffering. It is a striking discontinuity for many. Jesus repeatedly uses Gehenna consistently to refer to a place of punishment prepared for the wicked, including the devil, his angels, hypocrites, and the disobedient. He warns followers to literally tear out an eye or cut off a hand rather than face it.
Give us the vivid details that stuck. What specific imagery did Jesus use to describe this punishment in the Gospels?
The language is intense, it's visceral, and it's chilling. Gehenna is consistently associated with being cast into eternal fire. Jesus warns that Gehenna involves the undying worm and the fire that is not quenched, along with a deeply emotive and painful picture of weeping and gnashing of teeth. Crucially, the punishment is explicitly called eternal in texts like Matthew 25.46, which speaks of the wicked going away into everlasting punishment.
That sounds physically painful, not just existentially miserable like Sheol. And that focus on physical torment is a critical theological pivot. It requires a bodily element.
That is the key discontinuity that links back to the resurrection idea. This vision necessitated a major shift in thinking about the post-mortem state. Theologically, post-mortem judgment would require a reunited body and soul. This was necessary because the immortal soul alone was often thought incapable of feeling the kind of intense physical and sensory pain required for a suitable graphic punishment. If the punishment is weeping, gnashing, and burning, then the dead must be in the body in Gehenna to fully experience the unquenchable fire. Matthew 10.28 reflects this. Do not fear those who kill the body but cannot kill the soul. Rather, fear him who can destroy both soul and body in Gehenna.
So the language placed on Jesus' lips affirmed the Second Temple differentiation between righteous and wicked, but went a step further than previous Jewish texts by insisting on a bodily afterlife of conscious punishment, making the destination infinitely worse than the dust of Sheol.
Precisely. The shift isn't just moral, it's metaphysical. The focus moved from universal decay to individualized sensory retribution. And this trend toward accentuating the physical horrors of the afterlife continued rapidly in the later New Testament writings and the post-apostolic era.
We see that climax in the final book of the New Testament.
Yes, the book of Revelation intensifies the imagery exponentially. We move from the terrestrial metaphor of Gehenna, the valley dump, to the cosmic terror of the lake of fire and burning sulfur. This location is the final eternal abode for the wicked, the devil, and death itself. The torment, Revelation explicitly states, will be experienced day and night forever and ever. It is Gehenna amplified, visualized, and cosmically finalized.
And the church fathers took this terrifying imagery and just ran with it, using it not just for doctrine internally, but for external defense and proselytization.
Absolutely. Early church fathers were pivotal in cementing this. Ignatius, in the early 2nd century, emphasized unquenchable fire. But Justin Martyr, writing his first apology to the emperor around 155 CE, made the fear of hell a central weapon. He specifically employed the doctrine of eternal hell for apologetic and polemical purposes.
How did he use the threat of hell to defend Christianity to Rome?
He argued that Christians were driven by the highest possible moral motivation, the fear of eternal punishment. He asserted that if Christians truly believed that wickedness led to the eternal fires of hell, they would be far more motivated to live morally and be good citizens than those motivated merely by temporal Roman laws or philosophical virtue. It was a justification of their moral superiority.
And conversely, he weaponized it against Rome itself.
He did. He used it polemically against the Roman state, asserting that this same eternal punishment awaited those who refused to offer worship to the Christian God, specifically by participating in the imperial cult or persecuting believers. Justin Martyr clearly intended the eternal fire to intimidate and intimate everlasting suffering. This demonstrates how quickly this concept was instrumentalized, not just for theological clarity, but for ethical enforcement and ideological warfare against the dominant power structures of the time.
Moving into the medieval period, the concept of eternal suffering became absolutely central to the operation of Western society. This moved beyond mere theological debate and firmly into governance, social control, and even political theater. We need to understand the mechanism. How did the church transition from using this as a defense against Rome to using it as a tool for internal enforcement?
The medieval church dramatically instrumentalized this terror, solidifying its place as the single greatest incentive for moral adherence. Augustine of Hippo, writing centuries earlier, was absolutely pivotal in laying the theological bedrock for this solidification. Augustine argued fiercely that the suffering of the damned must be eternal.
Why did Augustine insist on eternity? What was the theological necessity for infinite punishment?
For Augustine, the necessity was twofold. First, to solidify the sheer gravity of sin. If the penalty for sin is merely finite, say 1,000 years, then sin is not truly an offense against an infinite God. Only an infinite penalty can match the offense against divine majesty. Second, it was necessary to uphold the perfect justice of God. If the damned eventually ceased to suffer or find salvation, then God's judgment was imperfect or temporary, which Augustine couldn't accept within his framework of divine omniscience and immutability.
So the doctrine was cemented not just out of cruelty, but out of a perceived need for logical consistency regarding God's infinite nature and justice. This laid the groundwork for the doctrine to be used as a practical tool for moral enforcement across Christendom.
And that terror had very practical teeth. Think about the implications of the most fearsome consequence the church could mete out: excommunication. It went far beyond a spiritual wrist slap.
It was a form of spiritual and social death, wasn't it?
It was a complete rupture. Excommunication immediately isolated the individual from the community, cutting them off from the sacraments necessary for salvation, which put them on the fast track to eternal hell. But equally important, it cut them off from commerce, trade, political relationships, and social life. This duality spiritual damnation, coupled with immediate social and economic ostracism, ensured the church's authority remained largely unchallenged. Few were willing to risk that complete, terrifying rupture from both this world and the next.
The threat was powerful enough that we see it used as overt political theater in the highest halls of power, not just as a quiet doctrinal threat.
Yes. A perfect example is Pope Clement VII, who commissioned Michelangelo's Last Judgment fresco in the Sistine Chapel. This happened during an era of immense turmoil. The Protestant Reformation was underway, and Protestant armies had recently sacked Rome.
So the papacy was under a direct existential threat.
Precisely. The monumental Last Judgment was a political statement. It served to reaffirm papal authority and doctrine at a time of schism. Its visual message was clear and terrifying. It reaffirmed the Catholic Church's exclusive claim to eternal salvation and served as a vivid, literal warning that all outside the Roman Catholic Church, especially the Reformers and their followers, were doomed to an eternity in hell. It was propaganda of the highest order, designed to terrify and enforce loyalty.
That focus on individual salvation, or more accurately, the intense individual desire to avoid damnation, even stretched its influence into the Western legal tradition, affecting commerce and social structure in some surprising ways.
It's one of the great historical ironies. Some scholars suggest that the origins of certain communitarian legal devices in the Western legal tradition are tied directly to this theological pressure. Specifically, the Calvinist theory of covenanted communities, which was rooted in the intense individual desire for salvation and avoidance of damnation, played a foundational role.
How does the fear of hell translate into, say, the establishment of a joint stock corporation?
The logic goes something like this. In a Calvinist community, success on earth was often viewed as a sign of election, a sign of God's favor and eventual salvation. They created legal structures built on trust and cooperation, moving away from simple individual greed, precisely because those communities were covenanted in their spiritual goals. Devices like the joint stock corporation and the law of trusts emerged, in part, as mechanisms for people united by a common spiritual goal to engage in commerce and pool resources, structuring their economic activities to reflect their individual desire for moral rectitude and salvation. So fear of hell wasn't just about moral control, it helped structure sophisticated financial instruments.
But by the Enlightenment, intellectual heavyweights finally launched a full-scale critique against the moral coherence of the entire doctrine. This is the great philosophical reckoning. The threat was politically effective, but was it ethically sound?
The central question of the Enlightenment became the ethical problem of hell. How can eternal punishment be reconciled with a God who is omnipotent, omnibenevolent, omniscient, and perfectly moral? This challenge, often called the problem of hell, gained immense traction because it pitted traditional dogma against the emerging framework of rational human ethics.
David Hume tackled this directly in his essays, challenging both the justice of the immortal soul and the proportionality of the punishment. What were his specific, devastating objections?
Hume leveled 4 main moral attacks against the traditional afterlife system based on proportionality and justice. The first was his proportionality critique. He argued it is fundamentally unwarranted to inflict infinite punishment for finite crimes. If a person lives a short, sinful life of 70 or 80 years, however evil, that lifespan and its actions are finite. To sentence that person to an eternity, an endless, non-diminishing suffering, is a radical and monstrous imbalance of justice. It's like giving someone a life sentence for a parking ticket.
That critique cuts both ways, regarding both hell and heaven, doesn't it?
Absolutely, that was his second point. He argued it is equally unjust to give infinite rewards for finitely meritorious acts. If life on earth is so fleeting and minor compared to an infinite afterlife, the entire system of moral proportionality is skewed. The reward for a limited period of virtue is equally disproportionate.
His third objection targeted the sheer randomness of damnation based on geography and circumstance.
He noted the profound injustice of the cosmic lottery. If eternal salvation is only available to those within a specific religious framework, say, only Christians of a particular denomination, then being born in the wrong location, say, 18th century Japan, or among an indigenous population that never heard the gospel, means you are losing the cosmic lottery by pure accident of birth. This notion, Hume insisted, is impossible to reconcile with a God of perfect, universal justice who wants all people to be saved.
And his final point was about the ultimate purpose of punishment.
For Hume, punishment without purpose is contradictory for a perfect moral being. In human law, punishment serves deterrence, rehabilitation, or social protection. But eternal punishment serves none of these ends. Since the judgment is final and the suffering is infinite, there's no chance of reformation, and there's no society left to deter. Such punishment, Hume concluded, appears vindictive and serves only to satisfy divine wrath, a trait he argued detracts from rather than bolsters God's perfection.
While Hume provided the cold, reasoned attack on the logic of justice, Voltaire delivered the passionate, satirical blow against the practical human consequences of religious dogma.
Voltaire, through works like his treatise on tolerance, made a scathing case against the madness of doctrinal disputes. He observed that arguments over incredibly minute points of theology, like whether the Logos was made or begotten, often depending on a single letter of difference in the Greek, were consistently described as theological madness. This madness led directly to bloodletting, persecution, and civil conflict. The threat of hell was the lever used to justify the violence.
He summarized the moral absurdity of eternal damnation with a provocative thought experiment that's designed to shock the listener out of their theological comfort zone and force them to confront the ethical stakes.
Voltaire asked the reader to transport themselves to the day of judgment and imagine the Creator addressing all the dead. He asked, "Would the Creator say to wise and virtuous figures known for their ethical lives, such as Confucius, Socrates, the Emperor Trajan, or Epictetus, 'Go, monsters, go and suffer torments that are infinite in intensity and duration. Let your punishment be eternal as I am'?"
That's a powerful challenge, condemning the most morally excellent humans simply because they lacked the proper theological prescription.
And the contrast makes the point even sharper. Would the same God simultaneously welcome into eternal felicity common criminals? John Châtel, Ravaillac, Damiens, men infamous for regicide and assassination, who merely died according to prescribed rules of a specific faith? The answer is meant to make you draw back with horror, demonstrating that the doctrine, when applied consistently across all of humanity, is ethically intolerable to a rational mind.
It strips away the theological context and leaves you with the bare moral implication. Is this just? Voltaire was essentially asserting that human ethics, particularly universal human virtue, must trump narrow sectarian dogma.
He maintained that we shouldn't attempt to anticipate the decrees of the Creator. He believed it an impious boldness for temporary human insects of a summer's day to pronounce others eternally damned. His conclusion was that religion should not be used to hate and persecute, but to aid each other through a painful transitory life. The Enlightenment critiques didn't just challenge the doctrine, they established a higher moral standard against which the doctrine failed.
The Enlightenment critiques permanently destabilized the traditional doctrine for the rational mind. But even if we ignore the proportionality problem of infinite punishment, the problem of hell runs headlong into the concept of free will, which is often cited as the justification for damnation, the idea that you freely chose to reject God and thus deserve the consequence. If the system is morally intolerable, maybe the fault lies in that foundational justification.
This is the core logical paradox, often termed the compatibility issue. The question is straightforward. If God is omniscient, God knows exactly how a person will act throughout their life. The medieval Jewish philosopher Moses Maimonides framed this question by asking, does God know, or does he not know that a certain individual will be good or bad?
And if the answer is he knows, then the free choice argument collapses.
Then it necessarily follows that the person is compelled to act as God knew beforehand how they would act. Otherwise, God's knowledge would be imperfect, which contradicts omniscience. This means the individual's action was predetermined, undermining the very justification for damnation, which is predicated on genuine, uncoerced human free will. If I was compelled to sin, how can I be damned for it?
This wasn't just a challenge in Christianity or Judaism either. Early Islamic scholars were wrestling with the exact same logical dilemma.
Absolutely. It plagued early Islamic thought in schools like the Mu'tazila. They struggled with the rigid orthodoxy of determinism. They found it morally repugnant to accept that a person could be punished for acts which God himself had predestined or commanded them to perform. They argued passionately for the necessity of human free will to maintain God's justice.
But trying to give humans true free will created a theological problem for them too, didn't it?
It did. When they tried to give human beings real power over their actions, genuine free will, they were quickly accused of the heresy of dualism. The argument was that if humans create their own actions, then you implied two creators of action, God and man, which encroached on the absolute almighty power of God. The paradox of divine knowledge versus human responsibility remained intractable. It's a kind of eternal philosophical Gordian knot.
In the modern era, critics aren't just questioning the logic of divine knowledge, but the very capacity of humans, these flawed and ignorant creatures, to make an eternal choice responsibly.
That's a crucial shift. Contemporary critics argue it is unreasonable for God to give flawed and ignorant creatures the responsibility for their eternal destiny. Philosopher Jonathan Van Vig, for instance, points out that in our human courts and ethical systems, we don't always honor the choices of human beings, even adults, if those choices are made under compromised conditions.
Give us an example of how that might apply to a spiritual choice.
He argues that God should not honor a final, eternal choice if it was made while the person was deeply depressed, mentally compromised, experiencing extreme duress, or even just acting carelessly, as in a last-minute panicked rejection. If a human being, due to their limited nature, cannot make a truly settled, competent choice for eternity, then God, in his benevolence, should not honor a flawed rejection with an infinite sentence.
The conclusion being that God should only respect a rejection of faith if it's a truly settled, fully competent choice made under favorable circumstances. And even then, the result should not be eternal torture.
Exactly. The dominant contemporary view among progressive thinkers is that if a person finally and competently chooses to reject God, out of ultimate respect for their autonomy, God might allow them to be annihilated, total extinction, but not eternally tortured. This brings us directly to the Great Erosion.
The Great Erosion. The traditional view of hell as eternal conscious torment is now widely rejected by many modern scholars and theologians. It's seen as culturally problematic.
The consensus among many is that the traditional view is now culturally unavailable. It simply does not align with the widely affirmed concept of a loving, universally benevolent God that permeates modern theology. The last century has seen a gentle but sure erosion of this belief. The ethical problems raised by Hume and Voltaire have essentially been internalized by the Church.
So what modern reinterpretations have emerged to clean up this theological and moral problem while still maintaining some form of final justice?
There are two dominant modern views. The first, and increasingly popular among evangelicals and scholars, is annihilationism, or conditional immortality. This belief holds that only the righteous are granted true, innate immortality. The wicked are resurrected, judged, and then totally eradicated or consumed by the fire extinction, rather than suffering eternally.
So the fire works quickly, accomplishing total destruction rather than being an eternal fuel source. The punishment is final death, not eternal life in torment. But how do annihilationists reconcile that with the scriptural language that seems to imply forever?
They grapple specifically with passages like Matthew 25.46, which speaks of the wicked going into everlasting punishment. Annihilationists argue that everlasting punishment means the sentence or the consequence is eternal, not the act of suffering itself. The wicked are permanently cut off. Their destruction is everlasting. Their conscious agony is not.
They are relying on scriptural language that speaks of the wicked perishing, being destroyed, or dying, rather than being preserved forever in agony. It's an elegant solution to the proportionality problem, granting infinite punishment, total extinction for finite sin, but without the eternal sadism.
It resolves the Humean dilemma perfectly, and it fits better with the idea of a loving God who wouldn't perpetuate torture.
And the other main reinterpretation moves away from the physical and the destructive entirely, interpreting hell as a purely subjective state.
That is the modern liberal view that interprets hell figuratively, not physically. It is redefined as a psychological or existential state of alienation, despair, or turmoil. This is seen less as imposed punishment by God, a divine warden throwing people into a pit, and more as a freely chosen preference or the victory of the human will to separate oneself from the divine source of life and love.
So in this framework, God doesn't send you to hell. You walk away from God, and the despair of that separation is the hell. It's an internal state, a continuation of a self-imposed alienation started on earth.
Exactly. This view is compatible with a purely benevolent, non-judgmental God, because any suffering experienced is self-inflicted, based on the integrity of human autonomy. It completely cleans up the moral problem.
What's fascinating, and what brings us back to my friend's observation, is the popularity paradox. While scholars and theologians are busy writing hell out of acceptable dogma, the concept itself is experiencing a curious revival in popular culture.
It's a remarkable sociological paradox. Serious scholarship has largely abandoned the traditional view, yet popular culture, particularly across certain media and social contexts, has seen a resurgence of interest in the classic fiery hell imagery since the 1990s. And this is driven by deep-seated psychological needs.
Why this resurge of interest in a doctrine that the educated class deems morally untenable?
I think this resurgence mirrors the ancient impulse that drove the concept during the Maccabean crisis. The idea of hell becomes popular when there is a socio-cultural feeling of extreme injustice, oppression, or moral disorder in the world. The concept satisfies a powerful, primal need for final, guaranteed justice for oppressors, for those who commit evil acts in a world where temporal retribution often fails.
So if the secular modern state fails to capture or punish the wicked, or if the wicked prospers mightily, the emotional, popular demand for an absolute moral reckoning increases.
The belief in hell functions as a cosmic moral ledger. The abandonment of hell is often mourned as the loss of this final justice, this sense that even if a tyrant or a corrupt individual lives a long, successful life, there is still one last terrible account waiting for them. The content of the doctrine, terrifying as it is inherently connected to the social circumstances of its origin and its popularity today.
What a profound and complex journey we've traced through this deep dive. We began in the silence and dust of Sheol, a place of universal physical decay, where all souls, good and bad, rested in oblivion. That concept shattered under the weight of Theodicy during the persecution of the Maccabean crisis, forcing the creation of a divided realm of souls. That division accelerated rapidly, escalating into the physical, eternal, fiery torment of Gehenna, driven by early Christian polemics and the necessity of defining the righteous in-group against its oppressors.
That terrifying vision was then theologically solidified by Augustine, who argued for the necessity of infinite punishment to maintain the integrity of God's justice. And it was quickly leveraged by the medieval church for immense moral and political control, even influencing the structure of institutions like our modern legal trusts.
We watched as this rigid, solidified terror ran headlong into the rational inquiry of the Enlightenment. Hume and Voltaire delivered devastating critiques on the grounds of proportionality, justice, and common human morality, demonstrating the ethical impossibility of inflicting infinite punishment by a perfectly moral God. And today, the debate continues, forcing modern theology to pivot toward reconciliation, resulting in modern shifts toward annihilation or hell as mere self-chosen alienation.
The takeaway for you is this. The fiery, torturous hell that dominates the Western imagination, the very image my friend was desperately trying to shed in that coffee shop, is primarily drawn not from the earliest Hebrew texts, but from imagery and concepts that were accented, intensified, and fixed in the post-apostolic and medieval times. It was a concept constantly developed and enhanced through ideological and socio-political pressures, providing a compelling reminder that the exact content of these powerful, transcendent ideas has never been static, but rather a flexible reflection of the culture's changing needs for comfort, identity, and most powerfully guaranteed cosmic justice.